In this video, you will learn about the service of sailors and Marines. In general, service in the Navy has a rather complex and multi-level structure. The Navy consists of surface forces, submarine forces, coastal troops, deck-based naval aviation, coastal missile and artillery units, Marines, the Navy's hydrographic service, as well as separate specialized units and special-purpose detachments. Each element of this structure performs its own task, without which the fleet cannot function properly. However, today we will focus only on those units and subunits where conscripts are called up for regular service. If a recruit is informed at the recruitment center that he has been assigned to the Navy, he will most likely serve either on a ship or in the Marines. These are the two main areas where personnel are in demand, and it is there that soldiers are most often assigned. But before getting there, as in other branches of the military, they must complete a mandatory stage, a basic training course known as KMB. Everything here is fairly standard, about a month of drill training, learning the basics of the regulations and elementary discipline. The next stage is training. This is where the most interesting and specialized part begins. The training process can last from 3 to 5 months, depending on the chosen specialty and location. The Navy has a wide variety of military professions. Operating any modern ship requires a lot of specialists, from motorists and signalmen to artillerymen and electronic warfare specialists. That's why, most often, after training, recruits are assigned to ships, because maintaining the fleet's combat readiness requires constant replenishment of the crew. However, there are situations when a shortage of personnel in the Marine Corps forces the command to send some of the training graduates there. Conversely, if more sailors are needed on ships, even those who were preparing for service in the infantry may end up in the Navy. So it all depends on the needs of the fleet at a given moment. Which is harder, the Navy or the Marines? There is no clear answer. Those who have served in the Marines claim that it is much more difficult on a ship, because life there is cramped, subject to strict schedules, and deprived of familiar conditions. At the same time, sailors themselves insist that it is much harder in the infantry, because service there involves constant marches, field exercises, and heavy physical exertion. Each ship in the Navy is, in essence, a separate military unit, a kind of state within a state, with its own internal laws, rules, and traditions. On board, there is a strict hierarchy, discipline, and unique rituals and features of service that distinguish a ship from any other part of the Army. However, in recent years, organizational changes have taken place. Officially, military units are no longer considered to be specific ships, but rather the docks, formations, and brigades to which these ships belong. Therefore, formally, a serviceman can be listed in a brigade while serving on a specific ship. But for sailors and officers, this makes no difference. Their life and service take place on board. If any of our readers are more familiar with the latest changes in the structure of the Navy, please write in the comments, as it would be interesting to learn the latest information. There are many different types of ships in the fleet, ranging from small missile and patrol boats to giant cruisers, aircraft carriers, and nuclear submarines. Each type has its own tasks, weapons, and crew, and it is simply impossible to list them all in one article. At the same time, the fleet includes both modern ships of the new generation with digital control systems and high-tech weapon systems, as well as old ships that have long been recognized as unseaworthy and are only waiting to be decommissioned. However, some of them are still in service, performing tasks to maintain minimum combat capability. Organizationally, ships are grouped into brigades, usually consisting of 5 to 8 units. Inside the ship, there is no division into companies, which is customary for land forces. They have their own system of subdivisions, the so-called combat units, abbreviated as CU, as well as various support services, supply, medical service, NBC protection, and others. Depending on the size and purpose of the ship, the number of combat units may vary, but on average there are 5 to 7 of them. Each BC has its own specialization. For example, BC 1, Ship Control, Navigation, Navigation Service, Signalmen. BC 2, Missile and Artillery, responsible for all weapons and firepower. BC 3, Mine and Torpedo Armament, includes torpedo tubes, depth charges, and mine armament. BC 4, Communications, provides radio and telecommunications, interaction with other ships and headquarters. BC 5. Electromechanical part, the heart of the ship. This is where the engines, turbines, and engine room are concentrated. This is the hardest and dirtiest work. Constant noise, heat, fuel oil, smoke, and swearing. But it is their work that determines whether the ship will move at all. BCH 6 is the aviation department, if there are deck helicopters or aircraft on board. BCH 7 is the radio technical department, which includes radars, guidance systems, detection systems, and electronic warfare systems. On large ships, the crew numbers in the hundreds, but among them there are usually about 50 to 60 conscripts. However, on combat ships, there are even fewer, only 5 to 7 conscripts, the rest are officers, contract soldiers, and midshipmen. This ratio is explained by the high technical complexity of modern ships, which requires professional training. Conscripts live in cabins, shared living quarters for dozens of people. A cabin can accommodate up to 20 to 25 sailors, and the conditions there are, to put it mildly, Spartan. Narrow iron beds are arranged in 3 tiers. Lying on their narrow 3-tiered bunks, conscripts open their eyes every morning at exactly 6 a.m. There is no familiar land-based wake-up call, with the meticulous shouting of a half-asleep orderly, nor the sound of footsteps in the corridors. Everything happens differently. The crew is summoned centrally via an internal communication system called broadcast. The loud voice of the bosun or the ship's officer on duty echoes throughout the vessel, and it is impossible to hide from it. The sound comes from literally every corner. Upon waking up, the sailors quickly get up, pack their belongings, make their beds, and prepare for the day's routine. Then everything goes strictly according to schedule. First is breakfast, usually porridge or pasta, tea, bread, and sometimes butter or jam. After breakfast, a small cleanup is immediately announced. This is a mandatory morning cleaning performed by all departments. Each combat unit, CU, is assigned its own area of responsibility. For example, CU-1, which controls the ship, is responsible for order in the navigation bridge and on the deck. CU-2, the missile and artillery unit, cleans and checks its combat posts. And BC-5, the electromechanical unit, carries out minor repairs and maintenance in the engine room, lubrication, tightening bolts, fixing minor malfunctions. On particularly large ships, there are also kitchen duties. To help the cook, 2 to 3 people from each BC are assigned to clean vegetables. These sailors can spend most of the day in the galley, armed with knives and basins, chopping dozens of kilograms of potatoes and carrots. The work is hard, but useful. It is always warmer in the galley than in the cold compartments. After morning duties, it's time for lunch, and then, if you're lucky, 2 hours of rest, the so-called Admiral's Hour. Conscripts see this as a real gift from fate, because they can lie down, relax, or even sleep. However, it does not happen every day. It all depends on the command's decision. Sometimes the Admiral's Hour is shortened, and sometimes it is cancelled altogether if there is urgent work to be done or an inspection is coming up. After lunch and rest, there is another small cleaning. The ship must shine with cleanliness. Then the work duties continue: painting the deck, checking mechanisms, training, or maintenance work, depending on the ship's crew. This continues until dinner. Friday is a special day, one that many conscripts dislike. On this day, a maintenance day is held in the ship's mess hall. Sailors assigned to the galley are forced to scrub the stove, boilers, floors, and even the ventilation system until everything sparkles. However, by Saturday, order is restored throughout the ship, as in any other part of the army. Everything must be perfect, the floors must be polished, the deck must be cleaned, and the cabins must be in exemplary condition. In winter, conscripts have another heavy burden to bear: snow removal. If there is heavy snowfall, the sailors are required to clear it until everything is sparkling clean. And not only on the ship itself, but also on the pier, on the helicopter pads, and if the ship is moored at the wall, then also on the adjacent areas of the base. The snow has to be shoveled for hours until everything is perfectly flat and clean. Every 2 weeks, provisions are delivered to the ship. On this day, the entire crew lines up in a long chain, from the truck parked at the pier, across all decks inside the ship, to to the special storerooms for food. Each box or bag is passed from hand to hand, and this chain works non-stop until the entire cargo is in place. This is a mandatory ritual in which everyone participates, regardless of rank or position. However, as the sailors themselves joke, some people's hands seem to have holes in them. Some of the food sometimes mysteriously disappears along the way, never reaching its final destination. Of course, in addition to performing their duties on the ship, conscripts spend a significant part of their time in various training and practical classes. After all, service in the Navy is not just about painting the deck and carrying provisions. A sailor must know and understand the basics of his profession in order to be ready for any emergency situation at any time. First and foremost, they study the ship's regulations, a kind of Bible for sailors, which describes literally everything, from the rules of conduct on board and the order of service to the duties of each crew member in battle or in an emergency. Particular attention is paid to the technical characteristics of the ship. Sailors must know what trim, heel, and rudder angle are, how a ship behaves in different weather conditions, and what it means to sail downwind or upwind. This knowledge may seem boring on land, but at sea, the lives of the entire crew depend on it. An integral part of the training is PSR, or the fight for the ship's survivability. This term covers a whole range of actions that must be performed when water enters the compartments, when smoke, fire, or other emergencies occur. Sailors are taught how to put on and use breathing apparatus, seal compartments, start pumps to pump out water, and extinguish fires in confined spaces. All of this is practiced, sometimes to the point of automatism, putting on a gas mask in 10 seconds, securing a hatch in rough seas, and correctly organizing the supply of water from fire hoses. Safety on the ship is a separate issue. Unlike land-based units, a ship is a space full of hidden dangers. The corridors are very narrow, and one careless step is enough to hit your head or shoulder. The deck is wet, and during rough seas it becomes extremely slippery. Sometimes it is simply impossible to stand without special boots with non-slip soles. The stairs and ladders between the ship's decks have a steep angle of inclination, and an inexperienced sailor can easily fall off them. Those who have served on ships can surely recall many cases of injuries due to simple carelessness. Someone got a scrape, someone twisted their leg, and someone even ended up in the hospital. In addition to training, there are always a huge number of different duties on a ship. They are divided by area, and each has its own specifics. For example, galley duty, helping the cook, cleaning vegetables, washing dishes. This is perhaps one of the least popular duties because the work is hard, and the smells from the kitchen linger throughout the day. Duty in combat units, CU. Each CU has its own responsibilities. For example, the CU-2 guard monitors the rooms where ammunition is stored. Every 2 hours, he is required to take temperature and air pressure readings and record them in a special log. The slightest deviation is recorded and reported to the authorities. The sentry on BC-5 monitors the operation of the generators and ensures fire safety in the engine room. Any unusual smell, noise, or overheating of equipment is a signal for immediate action. PVP, Internal Order Post, something similar to a land-based orderly. The soldier at this post monitors the arrival and departure of personnel, records who arrived or left the ship and when, and maintains discipline in the compartments assigned to him. There are indeed a great many duties on a ship, and each of them has its own specifics. For example, the mess hall duty is for those who receive food from the galley, ship's kitchen, distribute it to the personnel, and monitor the cleanliness of the mess hall and tableware. This seems like a simple but extremely responsible job. Feeding several dozen or hundreds of people is not an easy task, especially in rough seas. There are also specialists on duty. The electrician on duty monitors the condition of the electrical networks and lighting. The mechanic on duty is responsible for the operation of the main mechanisms and engines, and the hold attendant monitors the condition of the lower rooms and compartments where leaks or water accumulation may occur. There is also a survivability officer on duty, who is responsible for responding immediately to any incidents related to the safety of the ship, from smoke to water ingress. The ship always has an emergency rescue team. These are the people who are trained to respond to fires, flooding, or other emergencies. But a sailor's service is not limited to the ship itself. Each ship also has its own shore office, where teams are also assigned. This may be a guard at the checkpoint, a guard at the staff house, service premises, a guard unit at the unit, or even guards at the connection, including patrolling the territory. Thus, those serving on ships often find themselves on duty much more often than in other branches of the military. As for shooting, things are different here than in motorized infantry or airborne units. Sailors shoot very little. The main practical shooting takes place during training, and on the ships themselves, shooting is a rare event. And even then, blank cartridges are most often used, mainly for photo reports or demonstrations. Only during combat duty or special exercises can you see how ship guns work. And this is an impressive sight, because the ship is one of the key firepower assets of the entire fleet. We cannot fail to mention the traditions of naval service. The most famous and, perhaps, ubiquitous is the crew initiation ceremony. A new sailor is required to drink seawater straight from the side of the ship. Some crews make them take just a couple of sips, others make them drink a whole glass, and in some cases, almost a liter. Moreover, they must drink carefully, without spilling a drop. In 90% of cases, it all ends the same way, with indigestion, poisoning, and diarrhea. But the tradition is sacred, and everyone goes through it. There are also milder, but no less symbolic, demobilization customs. For example, on the day of discharge, a conscript is required to tidy up his cabin to perfection in order to leave with a clear conscience. After that, his comrades bring him his so-called demobilization items, the uniform in which he will return home. The farewell process itself is also special. The discharged sailor takes his belongings, raises them above his head, descends the ship's ladder without looking back, and is seen off with thunderous applause and cheers from his comrades. They say that there are countless traditions in the Navy, and it is practically impossible to list them all in one article. Therefore, it is not surprising that every sailor or Marine has their own memories, legends, and funny stories, which ultimately form a unique mosaic of naval service. So, if any of you have encountered unusual or rare Navy traditions, be sure to share them in the comments. They will be a valuable addition to the overall story. In general, service on a ship has a special romance that cannot be compared to everyday Army life on land. Everything is different here: uniforms, ranks, regulations, and lifestyle. The very atmosphere of the ship, with its metal decks, rocking motion, and the specific smell of paint, oil, and the sea, creates a completely different world, closed off, but full of its own special pride. Of course, it is still the military, which means all of its strictness, absurdities, and curiosities. For example, one of the subscribers recounted a funny story. Their ship took part in a parade, with only one side painted. From land, everything looked perfect, a snow-white, beautiful ship, but as soon as you looked at it from the other side, the whole truth about the Army's economy became apparent. How exactly service on a ship will proceed depends very much on the command. One officer can turn the crew's life into an endless series of dress inspections, work, and strict checks, while another will give them time and opportunity to rest, engage in education and training. In any case, there will be difficult periods, endless duty shifts, endless drills, rushes when the entire crew works to exhaustion, and rocking that is physically and mentally exhausting. But there will also be bright moments. For example, long-awaited stops at the shore, fishing right from the ship, swimming in the open sea, the opportunity to feel the taste of freedom, at least for a short time, and to take a break from constant duty. As for the Marines, their service is not much different from life in the Army. Marines undergo the same training in combat brotherhood and physical endurance, but with the caveat that they are considered the elite of the Navy, the infantry of the sea. The Marine Corps has many units: infantry fighting vehicles, reconnaissance companies, flamethrower units, communications platoons and battalions, snipers, artillery, anti-aircraft missile divisions, support companies and arsenals, and units for the comprehensive storage of weapons and equipment. Amphibious assault units, responsible for transferring personnel and equipment from ships to shore, also play an important role. In addition, there are units for escorting cargo and guarding important facilities. It is this diversity that determines the fate of each conscript. Where you end up is of great importance. It is, of course, impossible to describe each Marine Corps unit in detail in a single article, as there are so many of them, and each has its own specific characteristics, tasks, and features of service. Therefore, we will only briefly touch on the most common ones, dividing them into two large groups. The first group consists of units that are always ready for combat, which are often referred to as elite with a certain degree of pathos. These include airborne assault battalions, AAB, sniper companies, and, of course, reconnaissance units. It is here that service is considered the most intense and demanding. These units are distinguished by a high level of combat and physical training, and their personnel are selected with particular care. The main backbone, of course, is made up of contract soldiers, because the tasks here are always risky and require serious professionalism. However, conscripts are still being drafted there to maintain constant combat readiness and to fill the companies. In such units, shooting practice is regular and varied. Soldiers learn not only how to use small arms, but also grenade launchers and machine guns, and learn to work in teams, as part of a squad and a platoon. At the same time, the DSHB and reconnaissance units have their own bad reputation. It is said that this is where the highest number of accidents, injuries, and even cases of non-statutory relations were previously recorded. People even joked that most of the soldiers with fractures in hospitals are from the DSHB. And although much has changed in the Army since then, such rumors are still passed on by word of mouth. However, current trends show that the Army is gradually moving away from the old horror stories. And there is hope that for the current generation, service in elite units will be associated primarily with training rather than injuries. The second conditional group is the specialist companies, without which no battalion can function properly. These include the Engineering and Airborne Company, the Airborne Assault Company, the Logistics Battalion, Communications Units, Medical Companies, Anti-Aircraft Missile Divisions, NBC, Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Units, and others. Their role is no less important than that of combat units, although the nature of their work is completely different. Some of these companies can have up to 50 or more personnel, including both conscripts and contract soldiers. Others are much smaller, only 7 to 8 conscripts, and sometimes only 2 to 3 people. But it is precisely these small units that often become real families, where everyone knows each other inside out, and the work is distributed as clearly as possible. Service here may seem more relaxed, but it requires discipline and responsibility. Engineering units are responsible for fortification and demining, communications are responsible for smooth interaction between companies, NBC units are responsible for eliminating the consequences of chemical or radiation threats, and logistics are responsible for ensuring that the infantry has the means to fight and move around. As they say, fewer people means more oxygen. However, in the Army, as we know, along with oxygen, there are also more uniforms. Many of the guys who helped gather material for this story noted that at times it seemed as if they were literally living from one duty roster to the next. One duty roster ended, and a day or two later, they were back on duty again. This is a constant routine, without which the Army would be unthinkable. Unlike ships, where service is more static, the Marines regularly go out into the field. And these trips are truly full program. No one cares about the season or the weather. They can be sent out in winter or in the heat. Tents, potbelly stoves, digging trenches, camouflage. Conscripts experience all of this to the fullest. These are the so-called joys of field life, when you have to live for weeks in conditions close to combat. Sometimes these trips serve as a test of endurance and toughness for the personnel, and sometimes they are used to practice specific combat tasks. In essence, it is a small model of real war, only without actual combat operations. Perhaps later it would be worth writing a separate detailed story about these field trips, because they embody the very essence of Marine service. As for positions, in most cases, they are not much different from those in regular motorized infantry. There are the usual rifleman, senior rifleman, mechanic driver, mechvad, gunner operator, motorist, and other standard positions. However, depending on the specific unit, there may also be some rather specific positions. For example, in arsenals, the key positions are those of workshop foremen or operators, who are responsible for storing and handling ammunition. A distinctive feature of the Navy is that the line between specialists and those who came after basic military training is sometimes blurred. Very often, immediately after basic training, recruits are assigned to positions that are essentially specialties. This is due to the fact that there are a huge number of technical and narrow-profile areas in the Marine Corps, and there are simply not enough specialists on contract or from the old school. Therefore, newcomers are thrown into real work almost immediately, where they learn on the fly. The Marine Corps training program includes not only the mandatory study of regulations, weapons, and combat tactics, but also special courses depending on the type of unit. For example, security units practice actions in case of an attack on protected objects. In specialized companies, they study their profile disciplines in depth. Anti-aircraft gunners learn the principles of operation and use of air defense missile systems, often still of Soviet design, and learn to fire at air targets. Engineer and assault units learn about explosives, mine laying, and working with various engineering vehicles, such as the GMZ-77 tracked mine layer. Sappers study demoning methods, working with engineering barriers, explosives, and neutralization. Signalmen hone their skills in working with radio stations and field telephones and learn to quickly deploy communication lines. Artillerymen work with mortars and howitzers and learn to correct fire. In general, the daily routine of a Marine conscript is not much different from that of other branches of the military. Waking up, exercise, breakfast, roll call. This is the standard start to the day for most units. The only exception here is perhaps the high readiness units, where physical training takes up much more time in the daily routine than in regular units. There, sports can be several times a day: morning jogging, general physical training, obstacle course training, hand-to-hand combat, and mandatory weapons training. This is because these units must be ready to perform combat tasks at literally any moment. When it comes to the Marine Corps as a whole, conscripts spend most of their time either working or on duty or guard duty. The duties are standard: by company, by park, on patrol, on duty, and so on. The work can be very diverse. In addition to maintaining order at training grounds, in the park, and on the territory of the unit, they are sometimes assigned more interesting tasks. For example, in specialized units or in separate workshops, soldiers may be involved in the assembly and maintenance of equipment and weapons. In winter, some are assigned to special workshops where, under the supervision of specialists, they help assemble or prepare torpedoes, mines, missiles, and other ammunition for storage. This contrasts with everyday reality, when a significant part of the service boils down to carrying boxes, unloading trucks, or cleaning the territory. As for shooting, unlike ship service, where a soldier may only shoot a couple of times during their entire service, the situation is the opposite in the Marine Corps. Here, soldiers shoot often and a lot. Even the quietest units try to give conscripts practice. Shooting takes place regularly, with assault rifles, machine guns, grenade launchers, and sometimes even more serious systems, depending on the unit's tasks. Almost all conscripts manage to shoot their fill, and often this becomes one of the main sources of pride in their service. Equipment in the Marine Corps is a separate topic. It all depends on which unit you end up in. In a small unit, the fleet may be limited to a dozen Kamaz trucks and one or two well-worn armored vehicles, which are more often in repair than on the road. But in large units, there is a lot to see. There are armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery installations, engineering equipment, and even marine landing craft. For those who like to tinker with hardware, the Marine Corps can be a real paradise. There is always equipment available, and there is more than enough work to maintain it. Marine Corps traditions occupy a special place. There are many of them, and each unit develops its own variations over time. However, for a long time there was one tradition that was mandatory for everyone: the Black Beret ceremony. The Black Beret was considered a symbol of the Marine, and only those who had passed difficult tests were allowed to wear it. Forced marches, shooting, hand-to-hand combat, physical standards, and even psychological tests. It was a kind of initiation, after which the soldier truly felt like part of the Marine family. Those who failed the tests wore a regular beret and were still considered outsiders. While gathering materials, I came across an interesting discrepancy. Many people stubbornly distinguish between the concepts of Navy and Marines, believing that they are different things. There was even a joke: the Marines are death to the Navy. This sounds strange, of course, because the Marines are formally part of the Navy and have always been an integral part of it. But apparently, this distinction is due to the fact that the Navy and the Marines have completely different lifestyles, traditions, and conditions of service. The Navy has ships, discipline, and life at sea, while the Marines have field exercises, rigorous physical training, and combat operations on land. Therefore, even within the same branch of the military, people divided themselves into sailors and Marines, although officially they are one structure.